think we'll get started in just a sec here. If you could all kind of squeeze together and smile really big for me, I'm going to take a photo quickly. Okay, thank you. So this talk is responsive design along the conversion path. I'm Brendan Falkowski. I'm a front-end developer and designer at a company called Gravity Department. And you can find me on Twitter at Falkowski. And that may sound like a Polish name to you. It is. My great-grandfather immigrated to America way, way, way back. So I have a small bit of blood in me that's Polish. This is my sixth talk about responsive design and e-commerce. They kind of flow as a series. And they follow the path about how I think about the way that responsive sites should be built. Conversion's king, and analytics is the pedigree. And if you really want to solve e-commerce design problems, you should start by studying the sales funnel. There's a lot of rich data that's really easy to collect, and it really points in one direction today, that customers are going to shop using whatever device they have available on their laptop, or in their hands, or on their coffee table. Merchants are embracing responsive design with open arms because it does three things for them. It reduces their technology footprint, it increases their reach, and it improves their brand's consistency. Versus a proxy site or a native app, responsive design delivers a return on investment that's very high for most e-commerce businesses. And designing along the conversion path is an effective strategy that produces responsive design that really improves the user's journey from end to end. So we'll kind of go through each of these contexts and highlight what are the critical improvements or pitfalls that you can make. So most sites present these consistent structural elements across all their page types, and I call this framing. It's what delineates your navigation from your content, and that rigidity can help to improve how usable the site is. So at first glance, At first glance, most sites strive to appear really unique, but if you look at them in mass and a lot closer, you'll start to see that there's this remarkable sameness and a lot of repetition in e-commerce sites. And that's not necessarily a coincidence, and it's not bad for your business, because that familiarity is going to make a user's job a lot easier. They just want to buy a product from you. So it's tempting to design that framing first, because its impact is site-wide, but I recommend starting by studying the business and how they actually make money, and the product, which is what they need to sell, and then kind of work backwards to how you want to structure the site. So an example is an industrial supplier and a fashion house may have very different site architecture goals. And these are some questions that I like to ask them about how users may behave before or during or after their purchasing process, and then use those constraints to define how you frame the site. And this discovery process not only benefits your understanding of the design problem, but it's essential for responsive design. Because when you have just a few square inches of screen space on a phone, it's really challenging to represent all the primary actions that a user may take in a really compact but easy to understand interface. So the question is, how compact does it actually need to be? And there's a company called Huge that's done a lot of research into scrolling behavior, and they found that nearly everybody scrolls, and just as many people scrolled immediately, regardless of the content or design on the page. They just do it as a test to see what they can do. But there's a recurring problem UX-wise that I see with responsive implementations that aren't built mobile first. And that's that they kind of let the desktop site's kitchen sink, all those links and notes and things in the header, bump the actual start of the content far down on screen to the point where you don't actually see it. You have to jog forward almost a whole page length just to start viewing content. And you might not think that that's a big deal, but it probably isn't on the first few pages of the site, but we're always asking a user to shop and browse and move around. So it starts to become a bad experience when every page they have to scroll past these things they're not intending to see. Those framing elements are just a convenience to get around more quickly. They're never the actual content on the page. And that's not really different on a mobile device, so you should be thinking about that when you're designing how the framing works. And you can do better with a pretty simple approach. What I like to do is list out all of the elements that may be included in the header, and then try to rank them by priority according to the goals of the site. We talked about how the business makes money, what they do. Try to group them into logical sets, and then design the small screen interaction first around those big interaction groups. And then you can take those patterns and adapt them upward for a larger screen. And what that does is it effectively makes the goal and a task-oriented architecture simpler across all the devices in use. And a really minimal store can pretty plausibly anchor their navigation with just a few elements. But a very complex site can also do this. So if you have, you can have very comprehensive and efficient framing too. You just need to model and prioritize what those relationships between all the features are, and then try to find those groupings that make sense. And the same process can be repeated for information that's not priority, that could belong in the footer or another secondary navigation slot. So after several projects, you start to notice that the framing for responsive sites tends to skew more similar than different, and it doesn't necessarily shoehorn you into the same desktop type view, but that sameness across all the smaller screens is more pronounced. But don't really feel bad that those UIs are not mind-blowingly new and exciting. It's actually good for users that they recognize the same things over and over and they can navigate more efficiently. So providing that common access to elements of all e-commerce sites is sort of constraining. But again, that obviousness is just by nature a virtue of this kind of design process. And on a smaller screen, it really is more important to be obvious than to be fancy. So successful framing provides them with consistency and awareness and context without obstructing their access to content. So you should make that the goal with this first phase of every project. But good framing it really helps users identify and absorb the demarcation, sort of the barriers of what type of content exists on the site. But where they actually start shopping, most cases, depends on how your wayfinding is designed. And depending on the store's scale, this may combine a ton of different approaches. But I'm going to skip almost all of those because a lot of them are driven by marketing decisions. And the one that's really important is to focus on how hierarchical navigation is critical to defining a user's path through the site. So navigating by a hierarchy requires that you devise a taxonomy that not only represents the catalog, but it also enhances the discoverability of your content. So two stores that sell identical products, they may build completely different structures to facilitate a different shopping experience. An example would be a DJ equipment supplier. They could use a very dense category-driven taxonomy, or they could do something that's much lighter and driven by a persona of the type of shopper that's going to be there. And each of those taxonomies has a different plus and a minus that'll suit different shopping behaviors. So someone who's a professional DJ may be looking for something very specific that meets their exact compatibility with other equipment, whereas a beginner may just be looking for a recommendation on a starter kit. And on the surface, good taxonomy design leads the user closer to a product with every step, but it also has subliminal hidden responsibility, and that's priming the user's awareness of what's in the store and what they make available through their organization. So in responsive sites, hierarchical nav is a lot of times hidden behind a drawer or an off-screen menu. This comes from the app world, where things are very focused to a specific device. So some A/B tests have shown that this type of navigation drawer actually decreases engagement because when they're hidden, these things are sort of out of sight, out of mind. Users don't focus on them. So when I started designing the taxonomy for a client of mine, Skinny Ties, what we did is constrained that top-level navigation to 5 one-word categories. And the reason was that so we could always show this present on screen at all times. And this does 2 things for them. It saves users a tap when they want to dive into one of those menus, and it also makes people aware of the site's high-level structure. Even if they know they're looking for, a blue tie, they're aware that they could also shop by a certain width or fabric or pattern. So most M.dot sites, if you're coming from that side of the world where you build a separate property, they may just have a homepage that's solely a text-based navigation. And that's not very enticing to someone who's trying to shop for a very visual product like fashion items. So with Skinny Ties, what we did is make sure that those rich menus that are accessible on a desktop or a larger screen can still be used, and really encourage users to tap through each of those menu choices and see what options are available. And the taxonomy itself can really vary between stores substantially in its shape, the size of it, the density of the categories. And I try to stick to 2 guidelines here. In most cases, 3 levels is the maximum depth for their hierarchy to follow. So imagine if you're trying to go somewhere that you've never been before, but you're not allowed to check if you've gone to the right place until you think you've actually reached your destination. That's kind of what it's like if you're asking a user to go 4, 5 levels deep in a taxonomy and then see products for the first time. There's a good chance that they're not going to be in the right place, and then they're going to go back to the start and have to drive in again, which can be frustrating. So usually we can produce that very deep structured taxonomy, but showing it to a user actually can have some consequences, because it's easy for them to lose their context when either the start or the end of that big tree is obscured off screen. Again, remember, many people are going to be accessing this on a phone, so if you have a very deep structure, it's hard to see all ends of it and maintain your position. So beyond 3 levels deep, another thing to consider is that users can often refine their search much more effectively by filtering on product attributes and sorting them than by going down another layer in a categorical taxonomy. And the deeper nav can actually be harder to adapt across devices, because you think about on a desktop, those kind of suckerfish menus where you mouse over and then go down and then down and down. That's challenging to represent on a very small screen, and it's difficult to do even with a mouse on a large regular computer. So remember that wayfinding's a really important time to design for your site's discoverability. It's not purely about navigation, and you may not be able to pinpoint a very deep category, but a much shallower navigation that's easier for a user to scan may actually be more beneficial in demonstrating what your store has to offer. And it can show users a category that they weren't initially looking for, but they're now aware your store carries. And sort of adjacent to the depth of a taxonomy is the shape of it. So each branch of that hierarchy can either be very wide or it can be very narrow. I think the practical limit is about 7, maybe up to 10 children per category, but fewer is always preferred, because the less items there are, the more likely someone is to read them instead of just looking over it and ignoring it. And narrower branches in a taxonomy have several advantages. They're faster to scan, which helps the user absorb the structure more easily. They have more screen time across viewports. And a hierarchy that's taller than your phone screen can be disorienting to navigate. So for a root catalog, or for a catalog root, another problem is having too many categories in that first level of the taxonomy, or even just a few categories that have very long titles. You may not be able to show them at all times on any size screen. And this can force you to put that list behind a navigation drawer or button, even on very large screens, which is one thing that happened on this site, Gemaire. So you may be able to rethink the way your taxonomy is structured to come up with a simpler approach, but some catalogs actually benefit from starting users with a single layer, which is what happened with the Gemaire project. There are so many choices, but it's actually a lot more approachable for them to do this and make them start in one place than designing a multi-layered taxonomy, because as this branches out, it goes into hundreds and hundreds of subcategories. So for another project, Carrier Enterprise, we used a combination of tactics to make sure that their taxonomy is visible on the broadest range of screens that we can offer. And we use some technology like Flexbox in CSS to scale the category titles, both proportionally and make sure they stay aligned vertically. And then as the screen increases in size, we have enough space to add in some navigational cues like arrow icons that let them know these are expandable menus and not just links that you can click on. And then as we get a little bit wider, you can conditionally hide or show break tags, so those multi-line titles can be displayed in one row. And then as you get an even bigger screen, we actually take this top level of the site and drop it partially into the navigation, and we move the account level controls into those buttons so they're more visible. And then on very, very big screens, we do some adjustments to font size and padding, and we actually go back the other way and take out the multi-line for a second time so we can fit things more effectively. And there are some taxonomies that you just can't massage or reshape to fit a uniform or that typical pyramid shape where it gets wider the further down you go. But those edge cases are really important to identify as early as possible in the design process, because they really affect the way that you build the interface. And you may actually benefit from having different interfaces and behaviors for each section of the taxonomy, just because it has a very unique shape, or some of them are, differently formed than the others. So as you're going along, the opportunities you have to demonstrate the breadth of your catalog really do narrow as a user is moving along the conversion path. So as you're moving forward, you start to focus less on exploration and more on getting them toward a decision. And on small screens, those choices are even further limited. So this leads to the third step, which is wayfinding. And normally this is represented as a catalog filtering UI or a catalog list. Often the category and search result pages are identical or very similar in their presentation because users behave similarly in these cases and they have very similar goals. Oh, sorry. I'm catching you up quite a bit. Trying to do two hands at once. Catalog filtering needs to answer multiple concerns that users have at the same time. Am I in the right place? Can I filter this list? Is this the right product? And how you design filtering determines how your catalog's represented and assessed by users. So are these subcategories diverse? Are users shopping by the way a product looks, or is it by a spec? Does it matter what order these things are presented in? And how do users choose from the list which one is the right product to inspect further? So this is, for me, a really fun part of a project because no two stores are alike, and how you design that filtering experience can really differentiate the shopping experience a user has. So both Macy's and Cotton Bureau sell t-shirts, but Macy's has a very generic user interface because they also sell shoes and bedding and all kinds of other products. But a store like Cotton Bureau that's a very specific niche, they don't have to overcome that design deficit, and they can be much more focused in the way they present their products that's going to highlight and make them easier to sell. A store like Hardgraft that has a very small and uniform catalog of products can decide that they don't need filtering or sorting at all. They just present very large, high-quality photographs of their items and use the visuals to entice a purchase to scroll through and just see the whole catalog. But a catalog that has hundreds of products or thousands has a very different challenge. Sometimes the categories are too broad, so faceted navigation really has to shoulder that load of making it easier for users to narrow down. On small screens, Currys, they have a responsive site that renders the facets before the product list, but they keep them collapsed initially. This preserves the ability to show content first, but it also allows a user to have quick access to all those filtering tools. O'Neill Clothing uses an overlay menu to contain all of their facets. They can't be collapsed, but since there are only 3 facets, they decided that it's more effective to see all those options immediately. Another store, Low & Sons, collapses all their facets initially, which kind of focuses you more on the products than on the filtering UI. Sometimes they can show half a dozen or more, so this can improve scannability for the user because they're not focusing on the options of the facets. They can look more broadly at the types of facet they can filter by, and then expand the ones that they actually wish to see the options for. Another option, the store Lucy, they just have 2 facets by color and by size for their products. So they've chosen to gain permanent visibility of them, not putting it behind a menu or collapsing it. You can always see a filter for those 2 options in any type of category view. And that type of interface reduction can increase engagement because those UI controls are accessible directly. For very complex stores, like Jammer is an example from my projects, and Webstaurant store, they use a sidebar pattern because some of their categories have dozens or more facets. And what they do is have a sidebar off-screen panel that you can toggle on and off on smaller screens, or it's permanently visible on larger screens. And you can animate that panel's transition into view to kind of highlight to a user that they're entering a state of that view, and then animate it back out when they've returned to the list view or they've activated a filter. The key here is just don't be afraid to experiment and really think about how the filtering experience can be adapted to fit the store's exact catalog and the type of product experience you want shoppers to have. Magento has a UI that ships for this initially, but it may not be the best for your store. It's always something that you can tailor. And a final tip is that just on large screens, those filters are usually in plain sight, but when you get down to a much smaller view, it's difficult often if you're hiding them off screen or behind a menu for a user to determine what filters they currently have active. So if I want to see green items that are made of leather, I may not remember that after I've gone through a few different category pages. So a good thing to do is put a hint on those toggle buttons. So you can see directly that you have filters applied, and if possible, you can even list them out there in the header so you can turn them on or off quickly. So once a user has narrowed down their catalog to viewing a product, your design should really be nudging them to take action. So if I polled the room, probably 90% of you would immediately say the most important thing that you want a customer to do on a product page is add to cart. But you'd probably hesitate if I said, I want you to give me a list of the top 5 priorities beyond adding to cart. So when I discuss the product view with clients, we really try to drive home the point that you're not designing for conversion yet in this process. You're still designing for selection of a product. And selection may not mean add to cart. Because if 5% of the users that visit this page actually decided to purchase it, your conversion rate would be pretty phenomenal. But what's happening is 95% of those users are still selecting to do a different action. And if you think about what those are, almost everyone is not doing what you want them to do on this page. So it can be hard to design for them because it's more important at this stage to give them alternative options because they're not committed to purchasing yet. So to define what those priorities are, I like to do a 2-part exercise. The first one is make sure you have enough interests from your team represented. This means marketing people, sales people, design and dev support. And then list out all the actions that a user could take on this page. And this includes good things and bad things. I'll go back to that for one sec. They may decide to leave your site. They may decide to go back to a prior page, and you want to make sure that you're thinking of those as possible actions that a user may take. And then take 100 points and divide them among all the actions to sort of create a prioritized list of things that you want them to do. And each score kind of reflects the business's goals for that page. It's not necessarily how frequently a user may do those things. You could probably pull that out of analytics. But then by scoring all these possible actions, even the negative ones, you can make sure that they're considered when you're designing the page. So you can ask those questions like, if a user does leave, what was missing from the page that made them decide to do that? And you can also make a note if the priorities on this product view are different for certain types of products or categories. You may not want this to be identical for every type of product in the site. And the right time to design for and think about those variations is before you start implementing everything. So first you've defined all the actions, and then you start to define the content that's going to inform those actions. So second, you make a list of every component of content that may appear on the product view. And there can be quite a lot in some cases. So what I like to do is try to group them into sets that are either usually shown adjacent visually on the page, or they're similar in composition, related items, frequently purchased together, maybe a group that you can pair up. And then make a rank of those components relative to those user actions that you prioritized in the first step. So on the first pass, I like to guide teams to think in terms of a small screen because it's just easier to focus on a much smaller area. How's the user going to digest this page and interact with it? And that hierarchy, the sort of the order that things appear in, is a lot easier to do and for you to agree on as a team when you don't have to think about things like layout. So if the flow is logical on a small screen, it's more likely they'll be able to translate that to a bigger screen and still maintain the same type of logic. So you should also be prepared for someone who will always demand that the Add to Cart button is the first thing that's seen on the page and it's above the fold. So if you really identify all those things that users may act on, this may not become a problem. There's a designer, Luke Wroblewski, who sums it up that a call to action is really only effective if it's visible on screen at the time that a user decides to take action. So just because you show it first doesn't necessarily mean it's the most likely thing to be clicked on a page. And in fact, a research from Chartbeat found that users spend the least amount of time on any given web page in that space above the fold, and their engagement with the site actually peaks just beneath that layer. So if you put those primary actions at the very top of the page, there's a good chance it has a lower rate of being interacted with than if it's actually lower when a user has enough information to make a decision if this is the product for them. So products are in the cart. Fifth step, we're assessing. We're not quite converting yet. We're almost there. The cart's role in the conversion path is really deciding if these are the right products that I've already selected. This is where users appraise what they've put in their cart. They modify their selections. And anyone can really add an item to their cart. That's very rarely restricted on a site. But putting something in a wish list almost always requires you to create an account first. So users have created this little workaround where if they're thinking about buying an item, they'll just throw it in their cart. And they may not even be ready to purchase it, or they may still be looking for other items. It doesn't mean they're going to abandon that item, but they may never have intended to buy it in the first place. So the cart gets treated like a temporary wish list. And then a user goes through this mental checklist when they've decided to visit the cart, and it's pretty straightforward. They decide if what's in there is what they actually want to buy. They'll make some small edits to the list. They'll try to apply a discount code. They'll check the final price, and then they decide to begin checkout. And the ideal hierarchy for content here isn't really very surprising. You just do the same thing as in the last exercise. You define all those components and pieces of content, and then you sort of go with that flow. So a manifest shows the user what's in their cart, and it lets them modify the line items. And designing this responsively is challenging the first few times around because there's a lot of markup assumptions that this belongs in a table. And tables are very difficult to collapse responsively to a smaller screen and still maintain an easy to understand structure. So on a desktop site, that does make a lot of sense, but on small screens, it doesn't. And most stores will try really hard to stick with a table layout the whole time, and they'll do things like hiding entire columns that contain useful information, or they'll just let the browser squeeze everything down, so titles of products get wrapped like single words per line. So an example here is O'Neill Clothing. They have a responsive site with a 6-column manifest, and it drops down to 3 on small screens. So my question would always be, if you take 3 of those columns out, what is it that's not essential about them, and why did you have to show it on a desktop but not on a mobile screen? This approach has a lot of consequences, because if you do things like hide a column that contains an image, the browser is still going to download it in the background, so it's going to be a slower experience. The lines get limited to a few characters when you just crunch a table down in that way. And if you have a language that's very long, like German or Finnish, you can just completely overflow the table because some of the words just have so many characters in them. And lastly, once you have a lot of items in your cart and you begin to scroll down, the headlines of that table go missing, and it can be hard to see what's meant to be in each column, or you may lose an association to it. So if you designed this manifest mobile first, you'd probably never start with a table in the first place. A list makes a lot more sense, because then you can define the markup internally for each item, and you have a lot fewer constraints on how it's laid out at each viewport size. So Webstaurant Store does this. They design the exact composition for a small screen using lists, but then on a larger screen, they kind of fake the layout to appear like a table, and that's a perfectly valid approach. The catch-22 with syncing a large amount of buttons and touch targets into a very small space is if a user's trying to make edits to their cart and they accidentally tap the wrong thing, like delete an item, they could be frustrated. They have to go back and find it a second time. So one of the things that I've done in a project is rethink how many of those buttons you actually put into each line item. So a user is actually interacting with their cart in one of 2 mental states. They're either inspecting what's there or they're editing. And when inspecting, it's the information that matters. So they want to see the product name, the picture, the quantity they have selected, the price. But when they're editing, it's those actions that matter. Increasing the quantity, deleting the item, or saving it to a wish list for later. So the UI for this can actually be a lot simpler if you segment it into these 2 different states. Inspection is primary, so it lets them distinguish what product they're looking at, and then tuck away all the editing actions behind a separate menu. So one way you can do this is trigger a modal overlay. Just have a single edit button for each item in the manifest, and that'll let you take all those secondary actions, and it makes the manifest a lot easier to scan because it's not cluttered with different UI elements. But there's a lot of freedom here to design unique transitions. So there's a motion and movement baked into Relay Foods' responsive site, where when you click to remove a product, the whole table row actually slides to the side and reveals the delete buttons. And it kind of gives you this little tongue-in-cheek thing that makes you consider if you actually want to delete the product. They could have just done a very standard and neutral pop-up dialog that says, "Are you sure?" and you click OK. But the fact that they went a step further and designed a nice little interaction for it, it almost makes you reconsider whether you want to remove that product or not. But of course, converting is the ultimate goal of this whole process. So the checkout call to action can actually be pushed quite far down on small screens. Sort of like we talked about earlier, you want the call to action to be visible at the right time. So you may test placing a second call to act or a second checkout button above the cart manifest, so that if a user is browsing around, adding items, and then comes back to their cart later, they can just immediately click checkout without having to review it. But other times users will go back into the store, they'll leave the cart, and then they decide, yes, now I'm ready to check out. So you don't necessarily have to make them visit the cart again to review it. They can just access that from directly in the header of the site. So the mini cart menu, which is pretty typical on small screens interfaces, should always include a link directly to the cart and to the checkout so they can take the appropriate action no matter where they are from within the site. And there's a myth that checkout can be really hard to design for on small screens, and I've disagreed with that for a while because a good checkout flow is designed to proceed naturally. It shouldn't be distracting, focus on one thing at a time, and a small screen actually reinforces that behavior because there's simply no space to waste. Odds are that you need to collect 10 or 15 pieces of information to process a user's order, and your goal should be to make submitting that info as simple as possible. Checkout can be really annoying on many sites because every step of the process has these little UX snags and issues that you have to overcome. So if you fix a lot of very little things, you can streamline the entire process. Good examples of that are if the user has shopped with you before, you can recycle data from their past orders to anticipate what their address may be, their shipping info, payment preferences. More than likely, they're going to choose the same options they did the last time. If it's a B2C site, you can remove things like company name and fax number that are included out of box with Magento. If you're shipping digital products, you don't need to ask for shipping addresses. You can take those steps out entirely. You can get the postal code first before asking for state, city, country, and use something like a geolocation API to pre-fill all that info for the user. And odds are in a lot of cases it will be correct and they won't have to make an adjustment, so you'll save them some extra steps. Shipping address is commonly the same as billing address, so don't make them retype that info. And you can enable the right keyboard for the right type of input on a touch device. This will be customized, so if you're entering a phone number or an email address or just digits, you can get a simplified keyboard that's designed for that type of input. And you can improve the user's accuracy to make them better at completing forms if you correctly use the input attributes like auto capitalization, autocorrect, and spell check. It's really annoying if you're typing your name and it rewrites it to something else in the browser, and there are tools available to prevent that from happening. And lastly, use the data definitions for different types of form fields like first name, surnames, city, state, address. If you use the standardized labels in your code, then the autocomplete functionality that exists in browsers can actually help them fill it in much more quickly. And also, if you're using HTML5, which you definitely should be at this point, you can use the hint attribute to provide people with examples of what a form input should be. And that can reassure them that they're entering the correct value prior to submitting the form and waiting for validation to happen. And again, you don't have to wait until they actually do that form submission. You can do inline validation as they're completing the form. There's very basic ability to do this baked into browsers already, or there are many JavaScript libraries that enable this, but it's very effective, especially on small screens, because if someone's going through a long address form and they hit to proceed to the next step, odds are they won't be able to see a field that they missed or did incorrectly. They'll have to scroll back up and find it. But if they see there's an error immediately after they tab through to the next field, they're more likely to go back and correct it. So a handful of these small adjustments can enable a user to become a lot better at completing a form, and you can consistently improve their usability across all platforms. These are not things that are specific to mobile or desktops. And again, they're not responsive design specific either. Responsive sites just tend to get the best benefit from them because employing an approach in one code base works across all the devices that the site serves. So 7th step, finally, you converted the sale, the user completed checkout. But your job is not quite done at this point because the user's experience doesn't end until they actually receive that product from you and the package is in their hands. So how you design the post-sale to delivery experience can make or break all the hard work you've done optimizing for the conversion. You don't want to leave them with a bad taste in your mouth. And a small bit of consideration for that process can go quite a long way. Transactional email is often the first touch point after a sale, but frequently it gets ignored and people just use the default templates. So although it's just typically a notification that says we got your order, it's no less important for that to be accessible on mobile devices. There's an analytics company for email called Litmus, and they estimated that 53% of email was opened on mobile devices in 2014. And just from a few years ago, that's up from only 8%, and it's probably only going to be increasing. So the common transactional email scenarios for an e-commerce store are order confirmation, shipment notifications, tracking links, support inquiries, reminders to review products, sharing with a friend, or password resets. And many sites never consider changing those default responses, but if you take a little bit of extra care, you can ensure that those additional email touch points can, at the same time, make a better responsive experience, but you can also tailor the copywriting, the language that's used, to fit your brand. Chances are it's not perfect out of the box. And your last digital touch point with a customer is probably the last thing that they want to do, which is go into their account settings and administer them. So most transactional email will actually pull the customer back into this part of your site, their account dashboard, to do a simple task like tracking shipments, updating their address info, maybe canceling an order if they decide to do that, or checking a gift card balance. So if you look at how a big site does this, for example, Amazon, their dashboard contains 79 links. There's just a huge amount of actions you can do to administer. And I don't know how many people have actually clicked on any of them. I certainly haven't. But if you contrast this with what Amazon serves to their mobile website and their mobile app for iOS, it's only 15 links and 10 links. So you really have to wonder, why is the desktop site so confused and has so many features, whereas on a mobile version, they can really narrow it down to just these 10 or 15 things that are important. Or you could ask it another way and say, how does a mobile-only user, someone that really just has a phone, how do they access those other 65 links? Are they just really not important, or are they not things that people with phones do? Most companies don't have that huge set of services that Amazon does, but even a modestly sized dashboard can be fairly tricky. The responsive part of it doesn't have to be, though, in a lot of cases. So these are some patterns that I found useful to get dashboards that work consistently across devices. If they're really, really simple, like Bonobo's site is, they sell menswear, you can consider just inlining all those dashboard modules in one page. They really only have two things that a user can do: redeeming a gift card and viewing their order history. So rather than stubbing that out to subpages, you can just show it directly on the dashboard, and that makes it a lot simpler. Oh, sorry. But beware that inlining this content from more than a handful of modules can decrease scannability of the page. So if you have to scroll way, way down to see what modules are available, it might not be a good approach. Sidebar navigation is another common pattern that you can use for dashboards on desktop sites, and it actually adapts pretty well to a responsive site. If you just float that navigation to one side on a large screen, you can also tuck it away into a menu on a smaller screen. This helps skinny ties keep their menu system fairly compact, and it provides a little table of contents overview of what dashboard sections are available. But if you have a very complex site with many modules, it can be better to have a hub and spoke model where instead of a persistent navigation list, users navigate back to the dashboard through breadcrumbs. So for Carrier Enterprise's site, we use this pattern to keep every module focused on the actual actions that you're doing in that space, rather than on the navigation to other modules. And this is really important for them because they're a B2B site, so their customers are returning frequently every day to check the status of orders they're submitting. Sometimes they have approvers from within their company who are submitting an order under a different account, or they're modifying it before it gets processed. So they actually spend quite a lot of time in their dashboard. And switching modules can be really slow in that hub and spoke model, because you have to navigate back to the dashboard to switch to a different module like order history or pending orders. So what it makes sense to do is build into the menu system the same way with the cart. We always provide access to their mini manifest, a cart link, and a checkout link. Build an account menu so you can easily switch to any of those account modules. And that just improves their access throughout the site. They can always go to history or favorites or order templates, whatever they need to. So wrapping up, if you follow the conversion path, you can optimize across these 7 contexts. And this approach has been pretty effective for me, helping clients work through their responsive design's application to their business. But it's not a perfect way to do it. Try to think of it just as an exercise or a different way to look at your site. The best advice I can give is to just stay curious about it and really keep your eyes open. Some of the best ideas that I'm seeing in e-commerce design today, they're not necessarily coming from a responsive site or a desktop site. Don't forget to look at native apps, look at proxy sites, because people are solving this in many different ways. And a lot of them you can take and apply to a different situation. So thank you, and good luck.